Hello, Survivor Rights. We are here. Another week has passed. Hello, hello. We have a lot to talk about today. We're just sitting here chatting away. I didn't even realize it was 5:30 already. So, oh man, obviously this hour is going to fly right by. We're going to give just a second for people to hop on, say hi to everybody out here. But I'll be monitoring comments, Brice. So just so you know that. Hi, Fran. Hi, Daryl Johnson. Hi, everybody. We are going to talk today with Brice Erickson from right here in Washington as well, which is exciting. Go Cougs. Best cheese in the world, in case anybody doesn't know that, if that's a secret that hasn't gotten out yet. Anyways, we're going to talk a lot about the history of the church, the 2x2 church, the structure and governance, how that kept everything hidden, authority and control. We have just so much to talk about. And I can tell you, for those of you who don't know Brice, he is a history buff. And so we were just having a little conversation about he had never really looked into the history of the church because he was busy with history of the world, right? And so suddenly a letter came out that we all know about, and he started digging deep. So I'm going to have you give the credit to Cherie because I know that you and her are super tight on all that. But suddenly to find out that this church is man-made and has only been in existence for, relatively speaking, a short window of time. How did that sit with you? How did you find out about all of that? How did you assimilate all that information in a way? And was that the foundation of you saying, this is not what I thought it was?
Yeah, so, at the time that Dean Brewer dropped, I had, I've been in the church all my whole life, and I was in my mid-50s, and, I grew up in fourth generation. My great-grandparents found the truth, whatever you want to say, back in the 1920s on both sides of the family, and I grew up in a home that I was born into a home with a meeting in it. It had Sunday and Wednesday and oftentimes Union Sunday, and you had the gospel meetings, so you got an average of probably 3 meetings a week. My dad was renting a place and he was in the basement, Mom was in the upstairs. The folks in the middle had the meeting, and then the folks in the middle decided to move and they sold the place to my dad, and so they actually had a meeting in the home before they got married. So the workers moved into the main floor. So the Eastern Washington kind of doctrine, I think, is probably more conservative than it is in some areas. So rural parts of the country, they're a little more free to follow a little more old school doctrine. They don't tone it down as much. And so that's what I grew up with. And so we believed it was from the shores of Galilee. This was the original, You had people like Jack Carroll running around saying that, well, you can tell a false church if it was started by a man or a woman, and we were started by Christ. And, well, Willie Jamieson said basically the same thing. He expanded a little bit to take a ding at the Mormons and the Jehovah's and the Methodists. They were always after the Methodists. So anyway, you grew up with it, you believed it. Baptized on time, professed as a young kid. They really put the fear of hell into it. I think probably I professed because I was scared of going to hell, and that whole lake of burning fire and people dying in car accidents and there was a lot of pressure applied, shall we put it mildly. And, spare the rod, spoil the child. I'm ADHD, both flavors. And, oh man, yeah.
Right.
The meeting was a little rough when you were a kid.
Yep.
And the tools, I don't really blame my parents. I didn't have a lot of tools. I didn't figure out that I was hyperactive till I got into school and deemed learning disabled. We were able to control it we were able to tone it a little bit with some diet, but the medications at the time were pretty harsh, and so my mother didn't go down that road. So, yeah, school was a little rough anyway, but being 2x2 was not making it better. we didn't really know what we were called. We were a church with, no name. You meet in the homes. It's like all the Bible says. Yeah, got married, met my wife while I was on a bicycle trip, actually, and through a friend. And we ended up dating briefly and getting married and moved out to Pullman and started a bike store here. Ended up having, moving out of the shop. We lived up here for a little while. Same place. This used to be my bedroom. I'm in right now, but it's office. And then we moved out. Eventually ended up with the Wednesday night meeting in the home. I was backup elder and elder at another Union Sunday at the point that we left. But so we had kids, raised kids in the church, and then all of a sudden March of 23 comes along, and I'm on Facebook quite a bit because I'm running a business, and so I'm pretty confident with social media, but you never looked at the church. The church was what it was. You didn't want to, hurt your faith or anything. So I believed the workers, what they said, and the church, we believed it, hook, line, and sinker. And then Dean's thing came out, and I was on one of the forums that was kind of the hardcore in forums that somebody invited me to, and somebody posted a little bit about this Dean Brewer situation on there. And I happened to see it, and it was like, whoa, what's that all about? And I read it, and then I kind of went home and went looking for it again, and somebody pulled it. Well, that dumped me on Corey Hank's site page, and then I read the whole thing, and it's like, this isn't good. And that popped up. Advocates for the Truth just started to take off shortly after that. And you started to see the abuse. And it wasn't as, all of a sudden it wasn't just one thing, it was widespread. And it just flooded in. I mean, that just, those early posts were all over the place. And then, doctrine starts getting discussed. And the next thing you know, this William Irving dude's name pops up. And, well, what's that all about? Well, that led to Cherie Kropp's site, Telling the Truth. .info. And, Cherie's got the goods. She really has done the research and posted all of her footnotes and all of the rabbit holes. All the documentation is up there, and I started reading that. And that was a very rude awakening because everything I believed was now put into question. Turns out that, this didn't start at the shores of Galilee. It started at the shores of River Clyde in Glasgow with one William Irving going through Bible College or Bible Institute and reading Madame Guyon's book, a Catholic, depends on what mood the Catholics were in, whether they wanted to burn her at the stake or, wanted to turn her into a saint. But she was a big influence on a thing called Quietness Movement, and William was quite taken with her book he had read, and he then he was inspired by her, and he opened his Bible and put his finger on a verse, which he took to be his calling, which is Isaiah 41:15, and when you read it, it's a piece of Hebrew poetry, but he interpreted it to mean that he was called by God to be the sharp teeth of the thrasher against the mountains of clericalism. And he took it very seriously. He believed that was God's calling to himself. And that was what caused him to go over to Faith Mission and join them, the ultimate Scottish low-budget preaching operation down there. They're still around. They get just enough money to, you had food and shelter, and that was about it, and the rest of it was you were just out there preaching the gospel, and that seemed to suit William pretty well, because he was able to kind of be on his own and do his own thing, and he was pretty convinced. And then he, in 1897, fall of 1897, and John Long's diary has this in there, he was starting to wonder, the next, what do you do now? And he got reading his Bible, and he ran across Matt 10, and he saw the 2 by 2, Jesus sending them out 2 by 2, and he thought to himself, that's the way to do it. Why aren't we doing that now? And John Long later thought, I sure wished I'd spoken up on that, but he didn't. And, Wham went down that road, and they follow about a third of it. Well, you don't raise the dead, or, heal the lepers, or, there's some things that don't happen there. And they don't just go to the Jews, because that was a Pacific mission. But he really was taken with that 2x2, homeless, penniless approach. And I think it kind of fed that anti-clerical approach, because you had to be in the system, you had to get some education. To become a parish in whatever denomination you were in, they required some education, some training, some oversight. And Wham could just basically throw that all out the window. And all you had to do was give up your stuff, and which, by the way, wasn't really a requirement in Nat 10 either. But you had to give up your stuff, and instantly you were endowed with the Spirit to preach, and, you either fly or die. And so he kicked the concept around for about a year or so, and he was gaining kind of quite a following. And then in 1899, they decided to really test this and see if it was a thing. And they went up to Scotland, and they did what they called the bike mission. And they went up with some bicycles and rode around some parts of Scotland, and to see if they would starve or how it would work out. Well, they didn't starve, and it kind of worked out. Now, he didn't go test this like, proof of concept. You didn't go test this in, like, let's say, Italy or, somewhere a ways away. No, he went to Scotland, where he was, spoke the language, things were pretty familiar, and he got a response. So that was kind of the start of the 2x2 ministry, and in its beginning, they were non-sectarian, and they were preaching. They would just go out and preach, and hopefully someone would take care of them, and that's what they called faith lines without money. As they started to gain a bigger following, you had quite a few people. I mean, this was a time in England and in British Isles that, you had people that you were raised in a certain occupation, you were probably going to do that occupation or something similar. And now people were exploring the ideas of, I could do what I want. It was a time, and people were attracted to it. If you had religious, interest, all of a sudden you didn't have to go to seminary. You could just go preach. And Wham gave that opportunity to people. And there were people, of course, that didn't join that. And what do you do with those? Well, then they go back to their churches, which was faith missions thing, just preach and then you go to your church. In 1903, they had kind of another, well, what do you do with all these people that aren't the highest calling of ministry? Well, they read about a house church in Acts, and, well, let's do that. And so they created a house church under the ministry, to support the ministry, to be part of their church, and that's when things really started to separate. And they had taken on a very anti-clerical approach. So they were preaching hot and heavy, and you can go look it up, the Impartial Reporter. This was hot news of the day back in Ireland, so the Impartial Reporter would be going to the different churches, and here they were. Wham was just ripping into the clergy, and so that was newsworthy. So the Impartial Reporter shows up and starts taking notes in its newspaper articles. Cherie got a hold of those, and they're up on her website. You can go look under early newspaper articles. History Early Newspaper, I think, is where they're at. But when you start reading the preaching, these guys kind of would have made the old Westboro Baptist folks pretty proud. They were just laying into the people, if you off to hell, and the false preachers of the world, and oh yeah, they were having a good time. And that kind of got into the rest of them, because they assumed that they were right and everybody else was wrong. And that really got stuck in there. And by 1905, Joe Kerr, who was one of the followers of Wham, got a hold of a book called, it's spiritual something, I forget the name, but anyway, it's where the Living Witness Doctrine is pulled from. And he was, I think, kind of sounds like he was up at one of the Kinswick conventions up in Ireland, which was a lot of preachers up there. And he came back with the idea that none of them were saved. And kind of presented it to Wham, and that was the beginning of the Living Witness Doctrine. Now, they took it and manipulated that a little bit. Henry Drummond was the one who wrote that book in 1884 or something like that. And so anyway, yeah, they were taken with that idea, and they examined their church, and they determined that Wham was the thing, that God had raised him up, and that no one, you couldn't hear the gospel except through Wham or somebody who heard it from Wham. And that was the Living Witness. And then they determined that they had the sole franchise of Christ to that. So now we're, turns out we're a one true way. And turns out there were a lot of one true ways created in the 1800s. So it's not a new thing. It's just that they raised up Wham as a prophet. They raised him, they called him their father in some cases. Yeah, for being anti-Catholic, that's got a little smacking of the old Catholic Pope business. But yeah, they took on the Living Witness Doctrine. At that point, they really went to town on the dirty, devilish Methodists and everybody else. And so, people today say, well, we don't believe the Living Witness Doctrine because nobody calls it that. We don't call it the Living Witness Doctrine. I didn't even know the term existed till I read Cherie's book. Or I got on the website, and by the time I got the book, I was a little bit familiar with it. But the concept is still practiced. So all of these things that Wham really got started, he didn't believe in writing things down. So writing things down was not a Wham thing. They didn't write a doctrinal statement. So there was kind of a prohibition against writing things down. No buildings. No buildings were a big thing. That was, the churches did that. These were the homeless ministry. They did not have a building. No church building. The ministers were theoretically penniless, and in the early days they pretty much were. But people were donating money to them. Yeah, they weren't real structured. That didn't come till a little bit later, so it was quite a bit loosey-goosey there. And yeah, so the things you look at the Living Witness Doctrine, well, one of the first things they did with that was, well, if all the clergy are going to hell, then the people that attend those churches are also going to hell. And therefore, the baptism of the clergy is invalid. And so the only way you can be saved is to be rebaptized by someone who's heard the gospel from Wham, or someone who heard the gospel, which is the ministry. Yay for the ministry. They get raised up. This was the issue that actually got John Long kicked out of the church in 1907, and you can read the reports on that, the Impartial Reporter, and then John Long's diary. If you go to July, I think, or June of 1907, you can read the account. And what happened was John Long, who was a Methodist colporteur, he was distributing literature, and got hooked up with Wham about 1897 or so, and actually joined the church as a minister. He was Methodist, I think, from background, if my memory's correctly. But anyway, he joined and had been really right there with all these guys in the beginning, preaching the homeless stuff. And he was bringing people into the church, but he didn't believe that they were not saved, and so they didn't need to be rebaptized. And the Living Witness Doctrine stated you had to be rebaptized. You were unsaved until you were rebaptized by this church. And John wasn't doing it. And Wham publicly called him out during convention, asked him if he thought there were any clergy that were saved. John said yes. Wham gave him an ultimatum, and eventually kicked him out of the church. And this was done right during the thing. And he had people stand up. If you believed there were saved clergy, and John and Goodhand Patterson stood up, and they were the only two. And then 200 plus people stood up and said that they didn't believe they were saved. So Wham was working the crowd and publicly kicked out John Long. So exclusive baptism is a thing. Exclusivity of the preaching, because this is the one true way. So they can't have, you can't go to convention and have a guest speaker from outside the church come in and speak. That is verboten. We are exclusive, 100% exclusive, and, people are like, well, I'm not exclusive. Well, when was the last time, you go down the church, and a lot of the churches have guest speakers from other churches come in, other denominations even. The workers don't do that. No gospel meeting invites the local minister to come in and speak at their meeting. We're exclusive. You have to be in a Sunday morning meeting. You have to attend the gospel meetings. And, it's noticed if you don't, because then you're not getting the word, and you're not getting the word from the worker. So you've got the exclusive baptism. You've got the exclusive form of the meeting in the home and the homeless ministry. You can't record anything. Today, I can check out all the churches in the area. I can go on YouTube, and they're happy to have you watch their sermons. They record them, they post them without editing. They're right up there, no time at all. Questionable. Even call-in is really questionable. In some places, they're a little looser with it, but boy, those call-in numbers are watched pretty closely. And you have to get a call-in number, you have to be basically have been baptized or be a member of the church. You can't record their gospel meetings and their conventions and hear what they're saying. I mean, we're working off a lot of information because thankfully some people knew how to take good notes, good old shorthand. And occasionally somebody's vanity got the better of them, and they pre-wrote their sermon out and made sure copies were distributed. Jack Carroll being one of those that was kind of known for that. And then there's the letters. So when we're working from a history standpoint, we're working from those doctrines, those letters. So anyway, we have an exclusive system. We have the one true way. We're the one true church based on William's revelation. Well, of course, then William went kind of sour. About 1910, 11 or so, things were starting to, there were some things that William did that started to raise red flags in the church. And it kind of came to a head in 1914. We don't really know all of the issues because the stories aren't coherent. There was thing of William was having sexual affairs. That was one thing they said. They said that William got raised up. He got big-headed. They said that William had lost some of his revelation. They gave a variety of reasons. None of them were real clear what they were. But in 1914, the regional overseers, who were basically his right-hand men, stepped in and kicked William out of the church. And in that process, they became what we now know as overseers. And so you had the big boys most of these were really early William converts. They came from the 1887, 1888, or 1897, 98, 900, early 1900s group. And they rose up, kicked him out, and William left. He left with about $7,000 at the time. That's about $227,000 in today's money. And we know this because he got on a boat and he had to declare it, going to the U.S. And so he came over to the U.S., drove around, got a hold of a car, and was driving around looking for a man. And it was, at that time, World War I was in the background going on. And William had went down the road of end times doctrine. He was kind of down that road to begin with, but he really went down it during World War I. And he opened his Bible again, put his finger on a verse, and this time it was Isaiah 43, I forget which verse, and he claimed that God was going to do a new thing, and William was the new thing. And they didn't need them old ministers of his his alpha revelation. Now it was on to omega revelation. End of the times, and he was looking to find the man who would be drugs through the streets as one of the two ministers that he read about in Revelations, I think 13. So he drove around the U.S. for a while, couldn't find the man to be with him, and then went off to Jerusalem, where he stayed, waiting for the return of John the Apostle, who was going to come back and be with him. And he died in Jerusalem in 1947. He had his own following there. There was a group that broke off and followed him. And there was the ministry, the 2x2 ministry, the overseers, took to his alpha doctrine, kept all of it intact. and just moved the difference from the Living Witness Doctrine from Wayham personally to the form. And so Jack Carroll said you had to have the homeless ministry, you had to have the church in the home, and if you didn't have those, you were apostate. And so the form became basically the basis of their superiority. By 1916, and I have a picture of something Jack Carroll wrote in one of the People's Bibles here in Washington State, and he had written that Paul wrote 14 epistles, 11 to the saints and 3 to the workers. So they had already started to move the language subtly to point back to being the originals. They hadn't quite gone there yet, but they were heading down that road. And then he and George, George Walker, who didn't get along real well, they split the U.S. And so George took the Colorado line there to going down Nebraska, Wyoming. There's a split. In the split, Eastern went to George Walker's territory, Western U.S. was Jack Carroll's territory. And there were sub-overseers under them. But they were the two big dogs in the U.S., and England had its own big dog, New Zealand, Australia. Bill Carroll went to Australia. Jack's brother was Australian overseer. So those boys split it, and then George got the bright idea, it appears to be from what we've been able to dig up, to bury Wayham. And because it was kind of embarrassing. What do? How'd this get started? Well, our founder, we made him a prophet and then he went nuts. Or maybe he was nuts to begin with. That's a problem. And that's not, people are going to ask questions. And so they buried Wayham. They deliberately, coldly destroyed Wayham's thing. They destroyed every letter they could get their hands on, and they probably knew where most of them were. There's one they missed from 1911, and it's up on Cherie's site. And that one letter appears to be to Jack Carroll talking about money at conventions. So if you want to read about early convention stuff, and he also makes some digs at a few people. Willie Jamison got some attention for the love of the $20 coat. Wayham was keeping a pretty close eye on things. And so they went out and they hunted down everything they could find from Wayham, destroyed it. They cut his photo out of pictures. So if there was pictures and he was on an end, they'd clip that out and remove it. It was quite the thing. They did quite a thorough job. They spent a couple of years doing it. They rearranged their hymn book so that people wouldn't remember. They said, we're changing the hymns. The original Go Preacher hymn book, they moved on from that. Edward Cooney was an early recruit, really influential in the movement, and he was one of Wayham's early ones. He was much more articulate, very well spoken, and really went all in, bought into the Wayham's doctrine, and was kind of almost he was very articulate, so people paid attention to him. Edward, about 1914, really put on a campaign to try to see if he could get the ministry. The Living Witness Doctrine never sat well with him. And I didn't like it. He wanted to go back to the 1901, loosey-goosey, we're just out here preaching the gospel. We're not the one true way. We're not the one true church. He didn't much like the clergy, and he spoke pretty strongly against the clergy. So he liked the house church, but he didn't much think the conventions he thought were getting out of hand. So he mounted quite a campaign and then failed, because, once the thing of it is, once you become the one true ministry and the one true church, it's really hard to back that down. And once you've told people that, it's really hard to step away from it. And, Cherie's husband, Jester, he did an interview with David A-Link on YouTube, and he refers to it as, once they got hooked on the cocaine of the Living Witness Doctrine, it's really hard to go cold turkey after that. And once they had a point in 1914, I think there was a point where they could have backed it down. It would have been painful. They could have said, we wanted to be a church like, we're looking at the New Testament, we want to copy this, we want to be close to this, but the ultimate authority of the one true way won out. And that's when they started to tell lies about where they got their origins. And those lies took hold. of this being from the beginning. And they were tricky in their wording. These were not, they had 15 years or so to get their act together. These guys were pretty good at reading a crowd. You know, they lived rough in those early years. You had to be a good speaker to survive. You had to be able to read people. They understood psychology. They understood from the school of hard knocks how to, you know, who was going to respond, who wasn't. They claim spirit guidance, but you know, you spend enough time in front of that preaching like that, you're going to get good at it, or you're going to go hungry. So these little boys, yeah, they deliberately and coldly wiped out Wham, and then they created a myth. And so I'm suspicious that probably my grandparents, when they heard it, thought they were hearing the original New Testament church. You know, these 2x2 ministers came by. They didn't ask for money. They, you know, could point to some verses in the Bible, and they were pretty good at giving their interpretation. If you weren't real biblically solid or real educated, they could make a pretty simple argument by their actions what they were. Now, there were some who saw through it and they didn't like it. Oh, they also excommunicated those who didn't go along. So Jack and George, James Jardine, communicated quite a number of both the workers and the friends who weren't on the new program. Some had got contact with Wham, and that was a no-no. So if you had, it didn't, you know, some left with Wham, but others were still kind of in contact, and they were like, nope, you can't do that. We'll kick you out, and you zip your lips about Wham. And one of those was Alfred McGowan. They kicked out in 1919. One of the ministers, he went into work in 1907, but it was around the ministry earlier. And yeah, Jack and George and James kind of cut him loose. And he went and sat on it for about 10 years and thought things over. And then he started writing. And a lot of our early history, a lot of information is, well, he knew where it happened. And so when he writes of situations that kind of painted a roadmap for Cherie and some of the others to go back and look at. And it got up until, you know, 1950s. There were a few times that, you know, people stood up and said, I don't know, you know, but how do you communicate that? The church is really decentralized. It's not easy to get information out into the church. The workers controlled the narrative. Jack Carroll controlled it on West Coast, George Walker on East Coast. So, yeah, if you were in the church, you weren't going to hear a lot of dissension or real serious questioning. And it was Doug Parker in the 50s, the Australian, that was going to go in the work and then went up into Ireland and discovered that it wasn't quite what he thought it was. Who's this Wham guy? And somebody pointed him toward Alfred, and Alfred kind of enlightened him. And then Doug wrote an article called Spiritual Fraud. It was kind of one of the first modern publications talking about church history. And immediately that got into the hands of Cornelius Jenin out of Canada there, a history professor. I think it was high school at the time, eventually ended up at Ottawa, it's college professor. But he wrote a thing about, you know, this is from the beginning, and wrote a little publication kind of counteracting that. The timing seems to be very much deliberate. And he believed what the workers had told him, so he was applying his history to it. And he wrote about 3 more articles and then got called out for it in the 90s. And he then went and wrote a book, The Apostles' Doctrine and Fellowship, which was published. But anyway, if you want, Cherie's got she had contact with him, and she has a critique on her site. And yeah, he says it's not from the beginning, after wandering around 500 plus pages with a lot of big words and chasing a few rabbit holes. He comes to the conclusion, and then it was like Wham was raised up. You know, this was a God raised up this group. He doesn't like to talk about Wham. But anyway, yeah, it's I wouldn't bother reading it. I've read most of it, and it's not worth the time. But Cherie's critique is very much worth reading. Anyway, Doug Parker got around, and eventually, of course, we got into the 1980s. 1982, Secret Sect got published. There again, you know, how would you find a copy of that? Well, you'd have to run across a copy. How would you know it was about you? Because we don't take a name, you know, so And then some of the members of the church that had some money were apparently encouraged to buy and burn copies. So they reduced the number of them. Quite collectible right now. If you got a copy of Secret Sect, there's an online one out there, but and I think there might be a copy up on Internet Archive. So anyway, yeah, it's out there. Then there was Threshing Floor Ministries, and I think she just published a book. I've got it. It just came in today. The Truth About the Truth. So yeah, I got that in today. I'm ready yet. But anyway, and then we get up into the 90s, and then we run across Cherie over the fence with her neighbor, telling her it was the one true way. And to the beginning, her neighbor says, "Prove it." Well, that started something that almost 30 years of research there, and Cherie turns out to be the person to do that research. And it's because of Cherie's documentation currently we have probably the most accurate portrayal of the history, because she, of course, found Secret Sect, and then she questioned the sources on that and verified them, and she documented all of them. So, people sometimes don't like Cherie. I've heard shade cast on Cherie, but nobody's casting shade on her research. None of the workers want to get up and take that on. You can't believe everything on the internet. Oh, yeah, you can't believe that stuff. It's on the internet. You can't believe it. Well, they're not questioning her facts. I've dug around in Cherie's stuff, and boy, she is good. She has every dot and T and I in history. And it's, if you haven't bought Preserving the Truth, you probably should. It's well worth having and reading. You won't catch fire. I thought I might, but I didn't. Somehow I've survived that. Yeah, so that kind of brings it up to, and the interesting thing is that book got published just a couple of months, I think before Dean died or after, I can't remember. That's right about the same time that Dean actually passed away in 2022. You have Cherie publishing that book, and there is 25 plus years of incredibly detailed research, going over to Ireland, pulling up these records from the papers, all these letters organized. I mean, the sheer volume of it's just absolutely amazing. And that gets published. Well, this time it's print on demand, so go ahead and burn all the copies you want, because, Cherie can just keep printing them. So that was kind of there, waiting when Dean passed away. So when Dean passed away, all this research is there, and suddenly I could take advantage of it. And that was quite a thing to go in and realize that what Cherie was writing was the truth. Not what the workers were telling, not the Shores of Galilee business, not the Gittins letter, which, got written later, which he, implies that it was from the beginning, not Leo Stancliffe's, the history of the church, which you can go read on, I think it's up on both internet, it's up on Truth Archives and on Telling the Truth, which, he pulls some stuff out of his hat. And he should know better, because he was old enough to know. He was old enough to know, but he was a war hero, so, no one wanted to question him too much, because he was in an internment camp, and so he pretty much got to shoot his lip off any way he wanted. He said some pretty crazy things. Workers say the darndest things. Man, you can look up their quotes, and, oh my goodness.
Yes.
So you start going down that road, and, pretty soon, boy, you discover abuse. I had an uncle that abused. His name came up. Got a cousin that's not allowed in the state of Colorado. He was in the ministry. Both of them were in the ministry. Therold knew about my uncle, and he abused little boys, and Herb Erickson. And then, Therold knew about it, moved him around a bit, and then let him loose into the church. Set him up with a lady, and quite the thing. They were up to their eyeballs. Therold had already dealt with a similar situation before that, and did the same thing. And so there's abuse spread throughout the church. Of course, the numbers of that, 1 in 5 currently, if you're using, depending on whose numbers you want to use, if you want to use Cynthia's numbers, or if you want to use Prussack's and Hank's numbers, they come out about the same. And North American male workers, it's about a 1 in 5 odds, and that's probably low. that they're a child sex abuser. That's not counting adultery and all the other stuff that, the so-called celibate ministry has been engaged in. Yeah, quite a thing. And so, yeah, I kind of got it hooked on the history and started reading it and studying it, and started reading the workers' sermons with a little different eye on them, and realized that, yeah, misinterpretation of Scripture goes back to 1895 and the misinterpretation of Isaiah 41:15, followed by misinterpretation of Matt 10, followed by a relatively uneducated view of what a house church looks like. And there's a lot of information out there about that right now. If you want to go research it, you can go research about what house churches looked like from a biblical view. And, well, let's say it this way, we don't quite look like that. Sitting around reading with your Bibles, and that's a Wayham interpretation of what actually happened. That does not look like what happened in first century. So anyway, that's kind of a nutshell on history. Today I think a lot of people have found out what they want to do with it. It's a whole nother view. I mean, you have the cognitive dissonance, effect of it. You've been raised in it. You've been taught it. And to question it is going to require significant pain. You don't just walk away from the church when you've been raised and born in it and indoctrinated in it. That's not something you walk away from real easily. And they will shun you. Some more so in past times. Jack Carroll has a whole article about the proper way to shun. You can go look it up. It's about 1920 or so. They were, of course, anyone that had contact with Wayham or anyone that was falling away, how to properly treat them, and, you just had to cut them off. So yeah, today that's still happening. Depending on the area you're in, it's going to be more or less. And depending on who's willing to look, I think some areas have been more open in examining the doctrine. The ministry still doesn't want to talk about doctrine. They'd rather talk about sex abuse than doctrine, to be honest with you. They really do not want to talk about doctrine because their whole spiritual authority rests on Wayham. And the question is, so we know that Wayham didn't start, it didn't come from the shores of Galilee. So then the question is Wayham raised up? Well, to be the sharp teeth of the thrasher in the mountains of clericalism, God reached down in 1895 amongst all the people in the world, and he looked at Wayham and said, hey, I want you to go beat up on other Christians. I don't think that was God's call. I think that was, that does not align with the character of God. It does not align with anything that you read scripturally. So if that was Wayham's call and that's what started this thing, then we have to consider the fact that maybe Wayham was suffering some sort of religious delusion. It does happen. And he was exposed to mind chemicals. He was in a mine boss. Who knows what he was exposed to? Who knows what mental state he was in? Alfred McGowan has a certain sympathy for Wayham. And he treats him with a certain sympathy, and I think Wayham was sincere. So Wayham truly believed what he said. Now, was Wayham telling you the right thing? No. It doesn't line up with Scripture. It doesn't misinterpreting Scripture. He thinks he's called by God, but he was at least sincere. We'll give Wayham that. And he went to Jerusalem, and he died there in 1947. Jack, George, and the rest of those boys, that was deliberate. They deliberately took Wayham's doctrine, and they knew what they were doing. You don't go around erasing your founder accidentally. You don't say things like, all the false churches of the world, you can tell if they were started by a man or a woman. We were started by Christ. Jack Carroll was there in 1897 in Wayham's mission, so he knew where it came from. And, they didn't, in the early days, they admitted Wayham, started by a Scotsman. The newspaper articles, you got, New Zealand Overseer was telling the newspaper articles, started by a Scotsman. So the uncomfortable question is, did God raise Wayham up? And the answer is, look at the facts. Doesn't appear to be, and he made some predictions that didn't come true, so, how do you square that? And the current ministry has built on that, and they're so far down the rabbit hole that what do? You've told people you've got decades and decades and decades, and, you go around and people listen to what you say, and, you control a lot of money. Starting about 1934, Jack Carroll's letters one of his sermons, he talks about money in the ministry. And there's a little line in there, if you have an estate and you donate it to the ministry, they'll make sure it gets put to good use. And so as early as 1934, we know that they were starting to collect estates. Now, when you started to get out of World War II, that really ramped up. Thorold got in trouble with a judge, apparently, for trying to get his fingers in somebody's estate and got harped on. Of course, we know that Eldon, they were running around with these codicils, and, Wellis Prop up in Alberta got busted with one, and they were, you could do one last good thing for the ministry. Donate your money to them. Now, how much money does the ministry have? Nobody knows. But, if they were putting them in trusts and holding them, and they seem to have plenty of money to go flying around all the places, they can't afford to take care of any victims, but, they got plenty of money to take care of other stuff. And, there's nothing stopping them from being full disclosure of their finances, except for, see, back to Wham again. We go back to Wham. Wham came out of the Mason system. So Wham Irving was a master Mason. His father was master. His grandfather was a grandmaster, whatever that is in the Mason, but it's high poobah. And so you grow up in a culture, a lodge culture, and secrecy, need to know, is part of the whole cultural thing. Wham brought a certain amount of that to the structure of how the ministry operated on a need-to-know basis. And the overseers found that a convenient structure and have continued it, and they do not want any oversight from anybody because they're spirit-guided. But Wham came out of that. Now, funny part about that is there's another major one true way religion that started in the 1800s that also had influences by the Masons, and that was Joseph Smith and Brigham Young were members of the Masons. And that's open history. You can go look it up. So Wham, and we share that with the Mormon Church, of our founders were influenced probably by Mason culture. And they had revelations too, and they had a one true way, and they have their own doctrine. So yeah, it's kind of interesting when you start poking around at that. Now Wham, I don't think remained an active member of the Mason. He still identified with the lodge, later, but he didn't hide it either. He wasn't particularly being hidden about it. The early hymn books. The early Go Preachers hymn books had a number of hymns that were also in the Mason hymn book. The Masons had their own hymn book. And, Courage Brother, Do Not Stumble was in there, and some of the others written by different ministries, and the Masons had bound it. And, of course, they were familiar to Wham, so they got into ours. So, yeah, we, little cross-pollination there. Yeah, so it's really interesting when you start poking down at that, and a lot of the things today in the ministry, if you really examine it, they really go straight back to Wham. I mean, they've modified the doctrine. They don't state it as plainly as they used to. Occasionally, someone like Gary Paul gets up and shoots his mouth off and actually says the quiet part out loud. Jack Carroll was pretty open. George Walker was a little more subtle. He kind of liked to sneak things in from the side. Jack would normally hit it right on the front. So if you really want to know what church doctrine is, just go read Jack Carroll's stuff. Or Wham. Wham was pretty open. He was pretty inflammatory, actually. Used to hear these stories of how the ministry was persecuted. That was another favorite one. Oh, that was early on. And I got reading on that, and I remember when I was a kid, there was some worker, I think it was at Chelan. He was, in my mind, ancient, and probably was. And he talked about going into an area, and he suffered persecution. And I think it was probably 30s, late 30s-ish, he was talking about. And in his telling of the story, he talks about going into this town, and he said that he met with some of the other ministers, and he basically told them they were all going to hell. They were false teachers, and they were false ministers, and they were all going to hell, and then he suffered persecution. Well, that turns out to not be a new thing. You read back in the history of it, and there's an account of one of the ministers, they called them tramps, getting hauled before a magistrate, or going before the magistrate because he had been beaten up by somebody. And the story came out, what happened was, and this is in the newspaper articles, like 1904, he had been talking to somebody and had said that that person's mother went to hell when they died. And the person asked him, well, how do you know that my mother went to hell? And he said, Jesus told me so. And then the man proceeded to give him a good thrashing, was the word used. And when he complained to the magistrate was like, guy didn't beat you hard enough. But you can bet that those stories were told as suffering persecution for the gospel's sake. They told people they were going to hell, and when people reacted, you suffered some persecution for Christ's sake. I don't think that's quite how it worked in the scripture. But, yeah, they were pretty aggressive about it. It's kind of shocking.
Still doing it today. Still claiming that they are being persecuted today.
Oh, they're horribly persecuted.
By you and me.
And the latest one with, them trying to get Larry Getz back into the church, after the Grace report today. I mean, what do they think's going to happen? What's going through their minds? Do they think that they're going to be able to rent someplace? And, oh yeah, we're going to let this person back. We cleared them. They're okay. So Judy's going to be calling, and, it's going to be like, hey, all she has to do is now show them their own words.
It's unbelievable.
They just made her hobby easier.
They did. They truly did. And she's very good at it, I might add.
Yeah, well, she's got a point. They can pull the people, and she'll stop doing it.
That's my only point. That's the whole point on all of it. Be honest when you go to rent the space, who you are and why you're there and what you're going to do.
Yeah.
And who's going to be, they're not honest about it.
Yeah,
so then when
the liability issues are huge.
That's the problem. Yeah.
So
you can't get coverage when that's how you behave. I do not want to slow you down. We are going to run out of time. We have way too much to get to still. Oh my goodness. You are going to be back on here.
What next?
You're going to be back on here before long, man, because we got so much to cover. I had so many questions for you. Okay, so we have the structure and the governance. I wanted to just talk about how things are handled today. I love the historical perspective, and I love history for the reason that it almost always is a good indicator of how things are going to go. There's patterns that you can clearly see, and that is what fascinates me in my brain and how it works. And so I was just curious, as you have done this deep dive, which somebody's calling you Cherie Jr., I'm going to agree with that.
That is a compliment.
I would too, man. I would too. Is the patterns that you've seen in the ministry over the years, and you go back, you've said all of the things about the $20 coat and the gathering of the money and all of the things that they did then that they've did all these years, all the way through to where we are now. And what do you have? Any thoughts about that?
There again, it's really opaque up at the top.
Right. Yes.
Who is actually the overseers? Dale Schultz's name comes up, Ray Hoffman's name pops up. The ministry ain't exactly saying. We know at a state level or a regional level who the overseers are, mostly. We don't know, of course, anything about their finances because they keep that, that's top secret stuff and organized a little bit like the mob. But as far as who controls them or what influences are being applied or what influence they apply as a group other than the one leaked overseers meeting that somebody let somebody into that they shouldn't have, and we have some idea of what they were talking about, at least on their Zoom meetings. We really don't know a lot about what's happening up at the top, but we do know that they're mostly older men at this point. We know that the church is shrinking hard. We know that a lot of the young people are gone. I'm in Pullman. This was a college town. There was a time, 10 years ago, 15 years ago, we'd have 50 college students between Moscow and Pullman. And today, we're seeing fractions of those numbers that are in. And then those are, they're getting on the internet, they're reading the same information that everyone else can read, and, they're not as far down the indoctrination, and they're leaving. They're walking. A lot of people in their 30s have walked. There's areas of the country that are more the family pressures and the way that the ministry is indoctrinated is still holding. The older generation, you have a lot more to lose because you're losing your whole you're losing all your connections, and it kind of depends on how, the family's dug in. The church is a walking dead man. I mean, let's be honest. This thing is, the doctrine doesn't hold up. You examine the doctrine and it's not holding up. The whole one true way thing, the ministry doesn't, they want to be the one true way because it gives them authority, but at the same time they're trying to deny it. No, we don't believe in exclusivity, but then you look at what they do and it's like, yeah, well, you do. I mean, tell me, if a Methodist shows up at your house church and wants to take part of the emblems and wants to speak in your house church, every other week, what's going to happen? The ministry's going to come along and say, nope, you got to get baptized. You gotta be, coming to our meetings. We can't have you teaching somebody else's doctrine in here. We're going to draw a line at that. You need to hear it from the worker first, and then you can come to the meetings. That's back to the old Living Witness Doctrine approach. The problem is they're dying. And what's the issue is I think the church will stick around. And there's still a tiny group of Irvingites who followed William. There's a tiny group of Cooneites who followed Edward after he was kicked out in 1927. And this church is way better organized than either of those two. And they have money. So as long as the money is there, I think the church will continue. And it'll probably stick around for, a few more generations because, there's going to be some born in and they're going to go with this. But honestly, the church is not going to be what it has been because they've lost all the youngers. Do you want to bring children into a church that the only way that these predators can be saved is to go to their gospel meetings and go to their meetings? There's no other alternative. It's the one true way. Their only path to salvation is through the ministry. So, fine. Do you want to have your kids exposed to that? And all of a sudden, when you start reading the history, then that doesn't line up with what the workers are saying. And, the Holy Spirit is supposed to teach us truth. If that's what it's teaching, then, the ministry today can get on the internet and they could spread within a week probably their true history to every member of the church, if they wanted to. They could clear it up. We don't have to wonder what they could set the record straight, but they don't want to. Because they'll lose their power, people will stop donating money, and what'll they do? These are old men now, what are they going to do? They've spent enough time visiting people in care centers to know that, America's not a wonderful place if you don't have any money and you're old. There's a lot of ministers who are probably sitting there with that same thought. They believed what they were told, and they got into the ministry with good intentions. Some of them still have good intentions. Some of them are deeply trying not to look, because they bought in and they've lost their working years, and what's going to happen to them? You can't have a real honest discussion about it because they're dependent on it. And some of those people that join the ministry are probably the most sensitive among us. They felt the call, they actually did it, and the ministry has been priming that pump for decades, and now it's starting to lose its power to do that. So they're not going to attract people into the ministry like they used to, because the history is known. Most young people are not going to be. And then if you are attracted to it, then I've probably got some concerns about that too, because why are you attracted to it? What are you, it's a great place for a narcissist or a predator to have spiritual authority, and those people tend to rise to the top. And because the ministry can't police themselves because they're spirit guided, again, no one's there to keep track of your overseer. You go check the book called Tov. Scott McKnight wrote a book called Church Called Tov, and they talk about church, nothing to do with our church, but talks about church structures and how they go bad and how abuse happens. He also wrote a book called Blue Parakeet, well worth reading, because everyone claims, they follow the Bible. But what Bible do they follow? What parts of the Bible? Nobody's actually following the full Bible. I mean, that's a whole nother subject. But this church claims they are, but if you were out stoning people, you'd end up in prison. And if that's the way you were going to treat adultery in the church, we'd have a bunch of people in prison. Some would be ministers that got stoned. So, there's that whole subject of what parts of the Bible you choose to follow and what you don't. And that's a whole nother theological, rabbit hole that the workers are not interested in looking at, because then they have to start justifying where they're getting it from.
I am interested. I want to have that conversation. Brice. We're going to have that conversation on this show, because I am here to tell you, it's fascinating. When you truly do start reading the Bible, even if you stuck with the King James Version, like truly reading it, not in the way that I need something to say for Sunday morning meeting. I mean, reading it, seeking Christ, praying with zero intercession, straight to God. It's a completely different experience.
Yeah, and one of the things when we left, I left in December of 24, so I've only been out a little over a year and a half, although I will say the last year I was pretty jaded in the church. I wasn't following the program, but what really found was helpful was actually Bible Project, listening to the Bible Project podcast. Because the framework that we approached Christianity was from Wham and Scripture out of context. And when you start looking at it, and Bible Project's not selling any particular thing, they're just looking at Scripture in context and history and, what it actually says. It's not any particular denomination's approach. But, you can fact check it, you can read it, and, that was hugely helpful in kind of redefining a lot of things, because I was raised with, God is one hand extended to you and the other hand just raised back to whack you. And, the moment you step out of line, are you,
Yeah.
heading for the lake of fire, baby.
Yep.
And the workers kind of taught that. Got to keep coming to the meetings, got to keep, boy, it's just, you don't know if you make it until you die. And then, they get up at the funeral. Oh, yeah, they're the faithful person going to, we know where they're going and this and that and the other. Where if they were honest, because they say, that's just, well, we don't judge people. Well, right. You sure do, because you give them a good send-off. You don't get up there and say, well, we don't know. Maybe they did. Maybe they didn't. We won't know until, Jesus returns. We're not going to have a clue. So we sure hope he made it. Or she made it. The irony of that is just amazing.
It is. So here's the thing. I don't know you that well, but the two things I want to say. And the first is that I have for myself, and again, I say on the show all the time, we are not here to tell anybody what to believe. We have all kinds of speakers on and everybody comes and goes and whatever. So we're not here to say yes or no or whatever. But what I will say is that, my Bible is very clear about love and Jesus' love and the spirit of love. And that is what I have chosen personally. That is how I have choose to live my life. I love people that are still going to meeting. I hate that we have a us versus them thing going on. I hate that they're so defensive. I wish we could just love them out, but, whatever. But that's just neither here nor there, I guess. I mean,
it actually kind of is, because remember, this church was founded by a man who claimed to have a call from God to be the sharp teeth of the thrasher against the mountains of clericalism. Wham's call was never to love your neighbor, never to demonstrate the love of God in any major way. If it had really been from God and he saw things in the churches around them that were not right, the response would have been how to show God's love better. How do we love our neighbors better? How do we fulfill the great commandment? How do we look at Jesus, the character of God, the goodness of God? How do we portray that better. This church was never founded on that. That was, the whole foundation was, people that had bad church experiences were attracted to it because Wham came along beating on the ministry, the fat, dirty, devilish Methodists, So it wasn't, people say, well, it started out good and it went bad. And it's like, oh, go read the Impartial Reporter from 1903 and you can decide.
I will tell you this. Here's what I will also say about my life today. I spend every single day of my life. My life is dedicated morning, noon, and night at this point to helping people even learn how to love themselves.
Yeah. We weren't taught that. You were, sinful from the beginning.
Yes.
And, you were heading to hell and, maybe you'd make it.
Yes.
And it's that fear. Fear is a big part of the ministry. Wham used fear extensively. If you read early ministry, Jack Carroll used it, George Walker used it. Fear was a big piece of it, and especially with young people, impressionable kids, that message gets through pretty clearly. So that's one thing I had to deal with is I was, fear was a big part of it. So, you come to the realization of the church isn't what it says it was. What do you believe? Do you even believe in God? Do you believe, where's your foundation at? What's, what do you believe? And, once you know better, it's one thing to not know. If you don't know, I can excuse that. But when you know better, you have to do better. And once you know, you're stuck with a choice of what are you going to do about it? Are you going to speak up about it? Are you going to sit back? Are you going to, we'll just let God deal with it? God, that's not the way he works. That's never been the way he works. If God could deal with it, he wouldn't have done any of this stuff to begin with. He wouldn't have partnered with the humanity. He could have just done it on his own. That's not his program. Going all the way back to Genesis, he's very clear about.
Yeah.
The humans have a responsibility.
Yes.
And a fractured humanity, and that's what the whole Bible story is really about. Trying to a new humanity and how people treat each other. The first thing it did is start killing each other. That's not God's intent.
Right.
There's a whole theological rabbit hole to chase down.
Yep. We're going to have the doctrine conversation. I agree. I say it a lot. I say it in a lot of times. I'm sure it doesn't take far to hear me say this, is the story of the person the flood is coming and the person's up on their roof because their house is getting washed away. And they say, God, send me a boat, or God, save me. And God sends them a boat. And no, I know God's going to save me. Send me a helicopter. Okay. And they end up drowning because they're waiting for God to pluck them off the roof. And that's how I feel about this whole scenario.
Well, and Paul spoke of this in Philippians. He spoke, Paul's over in prison and these people are running around preaching a gospel. It's not what Paul was speaking. And in one sense, he was like, well, at least the gospel's being preached. And they talked about that a little bit in meetings, but it turns out that was us. We got a gospel that was not a great gospel. It was not an honest gospel, and it wasn't a correctly interpreted gospel. But can people find salvation through that? And I think my grandparents did. I think my parents built a relationship with God. I think it affected them. But it's been hindered by the exclusivity and the lies and the deception of the early church. So, people wonder, well, can they find salvation? Well, there's 2.4 billion Christians in the world today. There's 2.4 billion.
Fastest growing religion in the world.
It is, yeah, and there's 2.4 billion out there. And we're just a rounding error on that. They say 2.4 to 2.6 is what they estimate, and we're a rounding error on that. We're the one true way, and if you listen to old Luther Rain, only half of us were going to make it. So you probably got half of that. We're off on the way end of the percentage. But there's a lot of people looking to find Christ, and there's a lot of good churches out there. There's some really bad ones. I mean, we come out of one, I've been there, done that. There's hyper-nationalistic versions. There's all sorts of ways that Christ gets preached out, but there's a lot of ones that are good, that are really looking to Scripture context, that
Yes.
are using, studying, looking to modern, better translations to try to understand what the Hebrew said, what the intent of God was. And it's shocking. We started going to one of the local churches after the first of the year, so we haven't gone very long, but watched their YouTube for a while, checked their doctrine out pretty carefully, and, they're not really spending a lot of time preaching. It's mostly trying to teach. The pastor, different ones in the congregation will be involved in preaching sermons from time to time, and they're very careful about, the church called Tav book. They've really taken to that. They actually preach on that for 3 weeks out of the year. They go back to that book because they don't want those behaviors in their own church, and they're taking active steps to prevent that. This church, when they found out things are off, they're not interested in making changes.
Well, that was the last question that I was going to ask you tonight, Brice, and we're going to do that because, my personal opinion, and I don't know, and nobody's asking my opinion, but anyway,
Maybe they should.
maybe, I don't know. I feel so strongly, I truly do, that right out of the gate, when this all happened 3 years ago, if at that time, I remember having conversations with my mom and saying, if this doesn't change, if they don't take accountability, they don't make the changes, I'm telling you, it's over. It's over. Like, you will. And I was kind, I was patient, I was everything. Didn't have a bad word to say because I love these people.
Mm-hmm.
And I was totally fine with that. But I said the day's going to come that they've had many, many opportunities to step up and own their truth, to make the shifts, to have safety and accountability be a part of it, to address the very clear ridiculousness around their lack of information relative to mental health. I could go on and on that list. I do still believe they had a window of time that was about that big, that if in that window of time, they had literally come clean and said, this is all what it is, I truly believe that the church would have turned and possibly even grown. They would be on a completely different trajectory. But I do believe that window has passed.
I
That ship
think
has
the window was
sailed.
1914, honestly. I think
Well,
at
that's
this
probably,
point,
I wanted to ask you
I
what
think
your thought is.
I thought for a while that they could change, but the problem is these ones who have made themselves the spiritual authority would have to give that up. And that's not going to happen. I mean, you look at these guys and they will, to their dying breath, fight for it. And you watch these people that we thought were different, and once they got into an overseer position, it changes them. The power and authority that they have, the secrets they have to keep, the lack of there was some kind of felt like for a little bit they might have some openness to some change, and then that window just slapped shut.
Yeah.
And I think there's too much, the weight of the history is too much for them. And to examine the doctrine, what do you tell? And there are people in the church that the exclusivity is, that's not a bug, that's a feature. You can walk around and look at your fellow humans and feel superior to them because you're the one true church.
They do that.
And, those people who have that mentality what would you do with them? I mean, they're going to blow up and leave because they're not going to tolerate it, or they're going to kick you out. So I think the church would just fracture apart.
That's fair.
I don't know. It's hard to say. That was, that window. If there was a window, that window, as I'd agree with you,
It's
is
irrelevant.
closed.
It really doesn't even matter. I guess I'm just an eternal optimist sometimes, but at this point, I am an absolute realist. I mean, I am literally here to say, and it is okay. So here's my last. I keep saying it's my last. My last question is: do you believe in any way, shape, or form that we can, like, even having this conversation? A lot of people are going to think that we are, like I said jokingly earlier, but it's funny because it's actually true. That's what makes it funny, that we're persecuting them. I don't feel that we are in any way, shape, or form. I feel like we are literally stating facts. And
Yeah.
I
and
don't feel I'm not out for anybody. I just want you to take care of the kids. Like, do the right thing.
it's, yeah, I mean, the whole persecution thing goes right back to, the early church, 1903. They were, basically one of the doctrines. That's really interesting. So no, I don't think they're being persecuted. They're just being held fractionally accountable. And the truth of their own history is being talked about, and their own doctrine is being examined. And that's not persecution. That's just facts. I mean, that they actually said these things. You have Everett Swanson running around. In 1969, he's quoted as saying, "Scripture is not the word of God until it's spoken by a worker."
Yeah.
And that wasn't Everett. In
Right.
Everett's defense, that goes back straight to Wayham and early doctrinal teaching, the Living Witness. We've got Wayham saying basically the same thing. Everett just said it in a more modern setting. So, they're not being persecuted. One of the really interesting accounts, though, is from 1903. I think it's January 1903, in the Impartial Reporter. Talks about a lady who had joined the church, and she is talking about the persecution she's suffering, and that's why she knows she's right, is because she's suffering persecution. And the Impartial Reporter's like, "Hey, we know this lady. She's not suffering any persecution. She might be." The ministry was, they were parading around in the streets, being obnoxious. And they're like, she's really no one's really persecuting her. But in her mind, she's being persecuted, and that's what makes her right. And so today, that same thinking is exactly there. There are some in the church that are looking at this, and they're misreading Thessalonians, 2 Thessalonians. They're taking that second chapter of, the great falling away. Paul's writing to some people that are truly being murdered,
Right.
for Christ's sake. And he's talking here and now. He's not talking to William Irving, 2,000 plus years in the future, and the group that comes off of that. That's just, I just use your brain on that one. But anyway, this whole idea of being persecuted, that is part of their doctrine, and they're pointing to it now. And, the people that are leaving, well, it's a great falling away.
Right.
That's what's happening. They're misreading Revelations, just like William misread Revelations. They're misreading their Bibles, and the ministry's been priming them for this for decades. You can go back and pull this stuff up, and they have been setting the stage. There'll be a great falling away before the return of Christ, and they're mistranslating Scripture in a lot of cases to put fear into people and to keep people in the church. And there are those who are self-looking at it, and well, this is obviously the end time. I mean, people are leaving our church, the one true way, and the devil's working on them, and they're leaving because they never had a good revelation to begin with, or they went on the internet and they liked and subscribed, and now they're now they're toast. They're Look who's leaving. I was an elder in the church. I believed him 100% until the facts showed otherwise, until the abuse showed up. Harold Sylvester knew full well what he was doing, moving people around. I was raised with Dan Hilton in our field, in the 80s. We had young people's meetings on Tuesday afternoons after school. They parked him there for quite a number of years, and now we kind of know why. Because he was an abuser, and they could keep him around and keep an eye on him, and he had a good recruitment rate. He got a lot of people baptized. He spoke at my baptism. He got a lot of people to profess, and yeah. The whole persecution thing, though, that's not accurate.
No, I was just curious what you thought, but
The Spirit will lead you into truth. That does not mean you lie about your church.
Right. And then when you already said this, then when you find out that is the truth, you don't keep lying. You do better, because you know
better. They know better. I found out,
it's not that hard. It's just not.
A number of these older workers now, they have known since 1982 for sure of the origins with William Irving. Because the secret sect came out, they were aware of it. They talked to some of their counterparts in Ireland where it was less secret, but nonetheless, they have kept that good old, Shores of Galilee business going along, and they did not tell everybody why they were the one true church and the one true way. They said Christ started it.
Yes. Yeah.
That's
Crazy.
a lot.
It is a lot. I never let these go over. I am loving this conversation, Brice, and I cannot wait to have you on again. We might have to do a comedy show next time. Shrouded Doctrine, because that would be just the best. Comedy.
I'm still sorting that out,
Well, that's my challenge to you. I could just see you doing stand-up relative to this, because we would all be laughing. You and Ted Harris. Oh my goodness. Have you been to gospel meeting? I love his gospel meetings. They're amazing. Anyways, on the Bill stuff, you watch those? Oh, they're awesome. I love it. Anyway, yeah, I just sit and watch the whole thing. I find it hilarious. Okay, here's my last thing. This is my final last question, then you get last word. I always give last word. My final last question is this. This is one of the things that a lot of people have asked me over time is, okay, so if God wasn't in it and it was, if it wasn't spirit led and all that kind of stuff that we know, then why do we all have such a feeling in us that binds us all together and that makes us long for that? My personal belief is that it's the human nature is that we need to belong. We want to belong. If we had been raised as anything else, that would be what we were yearning for. It's that human need that is in us for that. But I also think that we were all born with a spirit, and that is what we are. And I do believe that God was present in a lot of the people. I think he's still, like you said about your family, God is in the meetings. But how would you describe that? How do you answer that to people who are like, why are we all still so drawn to one another? Because as far as I'm concerned, you're my people, you're my tribe. This is it, like, not that I am exclusive to anybody else, because I have great friends, but.
Well, and I think, every human has a soul. God is trying to work with every human in every situation, regardless of ethnicity, background, where you're raised, what culture you're in. We're raised in North America, we're raised in a Protestant culture, but you go to somewhere where they're raised in an Eastern culture. They're going to feel similar senses of belonging to their groups. You look at Jehovah's Witnesses, you look at the Mormons, you look at churches that are high control, Plymouth Brethren, Holdermans, Glory Vales, all of these one true ways, you will notice that they're a little even hyper above the regular churches, because they really indoctrinate children at a young age, generally speaking, that this is the right way. And so the bond that is created, those conventions create an incredible bond. Those gospel meetings 3 times a week. I mean, I had Sunday afternoon, Wednesday, and sometimes, if the workers were ambitious, you had a Friday. Oh, yeah. Boy, you got 4 meetings a week. 3 to 4 meetings a week for
those 55 years. That's a trauma bond.
You're going to your whole social structure, and then you tell everybody that, the world, you don't want to be too close of friends with the world, because you could lose out. So your friend group, if you're raised by a higher level professing family, and they really buy in, your group that you're going to associate with is going to be limited, and so your whole culture is there. It doesn't mean that God can't work. Didn't mean that the ones that heard the gospel from the preachers that Paul said were not teaching well. Didn't mean that they didn't find Christ. They just didn't find as accurate of a Christ. And, depending on where they were at in life, whether that got more clarity or less, we don't know. And it's the same thing with this church. I mean, we are all raised in a very particular environment, and it wasn't like you could go look it up. The church didn't claim a name, so the secrecy level is a whole nother part of that. There's kind of all these pieces that play together. And so, yeah, we're raised with similar background. We're raised with our own special language. Mm-hmm. This is good. This is good. Cherie sent this to me recently. She found it, or somebody notified her. There's an article in the Coronet, which was published in 1946, I believe, of June or July, and they're interviewing somebody that was a censor during World War II. They were trying to intercept messages coming in and out of the U.S. through mail. And so the FBI was out there reading everybody's mail, trying to make sure that they weren't getting codes passed in and out. This was wartime. And this guy recounts in a paragraph or so in this interview, they ran across this church. And there was a wealthy businessman acting as kind of a postmaster, shipping letters in and out. And they threw everything they could at it to crack the code because the wording was unusual. And they thought it was some sort of spy code. And then they finally tracked down one of these ministers and interviewed him and realized it was just a 2x2 church talking in the language of the 2x2 church.
Wow.
The way, the truth, the falling away. I'm kind of mad now because I never got credit in high school for being bilingual. I speak 2x2. Can I claim that as a language?
You're after the comedy show.
Around stuff is just, it's phenomenal the way that they can say something without actually kind of say it, but then they dance around it and they learn it from the older ones. And they would have learned this early on, and then it got passed down through Jack and George and the rest of them.
It's passive aggressive times 100. It's unbelievable. Yeah.
Dearly beloved. Anyone that's sat through a Dan Hilton meeting goes, oh yeah, I know exactly where that came from. Because certain workers said certain things or used certain phrases.
Yes.
And you kind of learn what those are.
You do. We literally now are over for we're almost a half hour. Okay, does anybody have any questions? Otherwise, I'm going to have you guys. If there's any questions out there for Brice, I'm going to book you again. As soon as we hang up, we're going to get on that because there's so much to talk about, and it's fascinating to me. All of it's fascinating.
It's just kind of sad too because 3 years ago I believed it 100%. I was 100% there.
Yeah. That part of it is very sad. And I guess that's partly why I love the Millstone humor sometimes, is just because it does make fun of it and it makes it not quite as sad. But at the end of the day, I want to thank you. I'm going to give you last word. I want to thank you so much for everything that you have been, for being here, rearranging. I know you're a business owner and this was a sacrifice to do, but I really appreciate it. And I know a lot of other people do too. So this is information. And, none of us like reading. I love reading still, but if you're not truly a history buff, so hearing it come from you, the way that you deliver it, and I would encourage anybody, if you would put all of Cherie's websites and stuff in there, I can do that too. One of us will do that.
Yeah, just go ahead and put Cherie's stuff in there because Cherie's tellingthetruth.info. I mean, you have to dig around. She's got so much information in there. It's a little hard to keep track of sometimes.
Yes. Well,
but, you got to give her some credit.
She's amazing. Yes.
She's amazing.
She is. I tried to get her on the show and she was like, I'm not doing interviews anymore. I got it. Okay, my friend, last word goes to you. After all of this, floor is yours.
On the history side, I'd just do your own research. Yeah, just check it out. You won't catch fire for reading stuff that's true. You can check it if it's true. You can see if it's what it is or what it isn't. And, it's, it's, once you start looking though, you can't unsee some of the things you see.
Yep. Can't unsee. Okay, everybody, thank you for hanging in with us. We still have 30 people watching at the moment, so it's been a show. Thank you, everybody. Have an amazing night. And I'm in the process of putting a calendar together so that people can kind of anticipate what guests are coming before just a weekend ahead. So if you'll hang on out there, I'm going to be getting on your calendar. So thanks, everybody, and have a wonderful night. That was awesome.